to get up and running with our practice environment, which will allow us to practice different configurations throughout the course as well as practically apply our knowledge. We are going to be working with virtualization and more specifically virtual machines. Virtualization allows us to emulate a computer system as if we have the computer system itself. So think about it right now. Maybe you are on a Windows or Mac computer. With virtual machines, we can create a new quote machine, which will allow us to basically say, hey, I have this software installed and it emulates a real computer system. To create new virtual machines, we first must install a hypervisor. A hypervisor is a computer software, it can also be firmware or hardware, which allows us to create and run these virtual machines. Now, when we install this hypervisor will run the virtual machines, which will allow us to emulate those systems. So in this case, the hypervisor, which the system is running on, is called our host machine. And each virtual machine that we create within this hypervisor is called a guest machine. So we're going to go ahead and install a hypervisor called VirtualBox, which is a free hypervisor to download. And from here, we can go ahead and create our first virtual machine. And in this case, we are quickly going to set up a Windows 10 Enterprise VM on our computer. Before we get started with installing Oracle VirtualBox inside our host machine, we first need to make sure virtualization is turned on within our computer's CPU. To turn this setting on, we first must enter the BIOS, which is a firmware program which provides settings to adjust operating system settings and also programs. To enter the BIOS, we first must restart our computer, and before the login screen is outputted to the screen, you must use the computer model issued hotkey to enter the BIOS. Once inside the BIOS, you can use the arrow keys to navigate around the menus until you find the virtualization tab, and then you have to ensure that this is enabled. Before you restart your computer, perform a simple Google search to find the hotkey used to enter the BIOS specific to your laptop or computer model. Usually it's F1 or F2, but it can be different depending on the computer model you have. Once you have found this hotkey, look up how to turn on virtualization for your specific computer model. I have the Lenovo X1 Carbon 6th generation, so I'm going to go ahead and just look up Lenovo X1 Carbon Gen 6 BIOS hotkey. Here's that it's going to be F1 or F2 for the supplied to get into the BIOS, so I'm going to supply both F1 and F2 simultaneously. Next, let's go ahead and look up how to enable virtualization. It appears I'm going to go to the security tab once I'm in the BIOS and then go ahead and choose the Intel virtualization technology and enable that. Alright, so here in front of me I have my laptop restarting. I don't have a hardware recorder here, so I'm doing it the good old method of recording my screen. So here it says to interrupt, press enter. So I'm going to go ahead and press enter there upon startup in the menu. Here we can see what we want to do. In this case, we want to enter the BIOS setup, so we're going to press F1. Entering setup, and there we go. Alright, so at this point, we can go ahead and use the arrow keys to hover over to security. And down here, you're going to see a setting called virtualization. Press enter upon here. And here you can see Intel R virtualization technology and also the other features. I have both of these enabled already, but you can go ahead and enable these. It may be, again, a little different depending on your hardware model. Oftentimes in the BIOS, you will see a little keyboard shortcuts which will allow you to save and exit. So in this case, mine is F10. So I'm going to go ahead and press F10. Then it's going to prompt me for saving my configuration changes. Press enter. And now we have virtualization enabled with our computer. We're just going to go ahead and let it set up. And from here, we can go ahead and install the VirtualBox hypervisor. Let's go ahead and install our first virtual environment to play around with different operating systems and machines. And we can do this through the use of VirtualBox, also known as a hypervisor. Through the power of a hypervisor, we can play around with other operating systems such as Linux and other Windows 10 distributions. So in this case, let's go ahead and go to our browser here if you are on a Windows or Mac machine. And simply, we're going to look up a VirtualBox. Here, we're going to go ahead and go to Downloads, and you can supply which platform you want. In this case, I am looking for Windows, but if you are an OS X, you can choose Windows, or we can choose OS X. Once you have clicked Windows Hosts, you're going to go ahead and click Save File, and I'm going to fast forward until this has completed installing. Okay, it is finished installing. We can go ahead and open the file. Here, we're just going to go ahead and go through the default setup wizard, choosing Next, using the defaults. You can choose the options if you want. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and choose all of them. And I'm going to go ahead and click Yes. And then go ahead and click Install. This will take a few minutes. We're going to go ahead and allow this to install. Okay, this has finished. Now we can go ahead and click Finish. And as you can see here, we now have Oracle VM VirtualBox downloaded on our machine. From here, we can go ahead and start creating new virtual machines. And in this case, we're actually going to go ahead and create a new virtual machine on this VirtualBox here. The next software we are going to install is optional, but I would recommend that you go ahead and install it if you haven't installed an archiver program before. In this case, we are going to go ahead and install Winrar Archiver. And an archiver allows you to compile multiple files together. It allows for easier storage, and it's a handy tool or software to have in the future, and something that you'll be using as you continue to explore cybersecurity. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and go to Winrar, and we are going to install Winrar. Go to Winrar Archiver, go to Downloads. And in this case, we can use the times 64 or times 86. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and use the 64-bit architecture, and I'm going to click Save File. Once this is saved, we can go ahead and open the file. And we're going to go ahead and click Yes. And we're going to go ahead and go through the defaults, so click Install. Go ahead and use the default options, click OK, and then we can go ahead and click Done. Winrar has now been successfully installed. Okay, so after Oracle VM VirtualBox and Winrar are installed, we can go ahead and create our first virtual machine by first downloading an operating system. And in this case, we are going to be using Windows 10 Enterprise. So if we go down to Firefox here and you type in this URL, which is going to be displayed to this screen, we can go ahead and download a file which will allow us to get an ISO image, which is the operating system image of Windows 10 Enterprise. So here we're going to go ahead and click ISO Enterprise and then click Continue. In this case, we are going to have to supply the name and all of the data fields here. So let me go ahead and quickly type these in. Okay, so once these fields have been supplied, and you can put dummy data if you want into this. I'm not gonna go ahead and tell you to do that, but it's up to you how you want to do this. We can go ahead and click Continue, and in this case, we are going to be using English, and we're going to download the 64-bit version, and then go ahead and click Download. This will go ahead and allow us to download an ISO file. We're going to go ahead and click Save File, and then click OK. This is going to take a little while to install, so what I'm going to do is speed up the process until this has fully installed. All right, so the ISO has now completed installing. It is 5.1 gigabytes, and it took a little while, so it will take definitely a little while to install this. Let's go ahead and locate this ISO back into our downloads folder here. Here it is. Here is the ISO. And so from this, we can go ahead and create our first Windows 10 Enterprise virtual machine. Let's go ahead and open up Oracle VM VirtualBox if we have yet to do that. And here we can go ahead and go up to Machine and then click New. And let's go ahead and create our first virtual machine. Now, this is the process that you will do when creating different types of virtual machines, regardless of machine type. So if it's a Linux distribution or a Windows, this is how we create virtual machines inside Oracle VirtualBox. First, let's go ahead and supply a name. So in this case, we'll just go ahead and do Windows 10 environment. Here we can go ahead and click where our machine will be located. And in this case, I'm just going to use the default VirtualBox location supplied. Microsoft Windows, and in this case, it is Microsoft Windows 10. So we're going to go ahead and choose this. Then go ahead and click Next. This will allocate a certain size of memory. So depending on how much memory you have on your computer, you can allocate and adjust the size of memory. In this case, 1024 is 1 gigabyte of RAM, and that will be just fine for us. So go ahead and click Next. Here, we're going to go ahead and choose Create a Virtual Hard Disk. Now, click Create. And finally, for the VDI, we're going to go ahead and just use the default option, which is VDI. So then click Next. Here we have fixed sized or dynamically allocated. Fixed size allows us to add a fixed size or how big we want the virtual machine to be. And once it reaches that maximum storage, that's it. Dynamically allocated will allow us to set a default size, and if we continue to add more data inside this virtual machine, then the virtual machine will dynamically, or it will open up as we continue to add more data. So in this case, we're just going to go ahead and use dynamically allocated. We can create our first size here. We can set the size. In this case, we're just going to go ahead and use 15 gigabytes. We don't need too big of a size for this virtual machine. And finally, we can go ahead and click Create. Here, it will populate a new VirtualBox virtual machine inside here. And in this case, we can go ahead and run our virtual machine. But before we do that, we're going to actually go ahead and mount the Windows 10 ISO that we downloaded. So go ahead and click Start. So what this is going to do is it's going to go ahead and supply a prompt for us to go ahead and supply the ISO. So we'll go ahead and click this folder icon and then go up to here and click Add. Go ahead and go to Downloads, and in this case, it's going to be this ISO that we downloaded. Click Open. And then we can go ahead and make sure this is selected and then click Choose. And then we can go ahead and start the virtual machine. All right, so we're going to go ahead and let this Windows 10 machine load up here. All right, so once we get to the Windows setup here, we can go ahead and choose English, and we will go ahead and use the standards. Click Next. And then we can go ahead and click Install Now. And we're going to go ahead and fast forward until the setup has completely finished. Okay, so once we have gotten to the Windows setup, we're going to go ahead and click Install Now. Then go ahead and accept the license agreement, click Next, and then use Custom. And then we're going to go ahead and click the Drive 0, and then go ahead and click Next. And we're going to go ahead and let this install here. Once Windows has fully started, it's going to restart, and then it's going to bring us up into this screen. So let's go ahead and just run through the defaults. Click United States. Use the same keyboard layout. Click Skip. All right, so now we're just going to go ahead and let this set up. Here, we're going to go ahead and go to Domain Join instead. Type in the username. Create the password. In this case, I'm just using the default password of root. Don't use this in a real world environment, but because it's a virtual machine, it doesn't really matter. Go ahead and click next. Then we can go ahead and choose some security questions. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead. Go ahead and click accept. For now, let's not enable Cortana. And then we're just going to go ahead and let this load. All right, so this automatically logged us into our Windows environment. And here we can go ahead and select the network. For now, we're just going to click no, and we should have a fully functioning Windows 10 Enterprise environment downloaded with our virtual machine. That is perfect. Now, one thing you may be realizing really quickly in this moment is, well, my mouse is stuck in between the virtual machine and your host device. And in this case, that's okay. If you look down at the right here, you'll see a little thing that says right shift. And in your case, it may be something different. It could say right control or something else. So just go ahead and click the key, which would allow you to transfer your mouse pointer from your virtual machine to your host device. So in this case, right shift, I'm going to go ahead and use right shift, and this will allow me to go ahead and get out of my host device. And most likely it's going to be right control for you. All right, so perfect. This is now finished. So now we can go ahead and close this virtual machine by going up to the X here. And then let's go ahead and power off our virtual machine. Now that we have a virtual machine installed, let's go ahead and overview a few of the settings within VirtualBox. First, we're just going to start with the main VirtualBox, then we will move into the virtual machine settings. So here in VirtualBox, I have a new VirtualBox environment open. Let's go up to File and then use Preferences here. Here we can go ahead and change some of the defaults within VirtualBox. In this case, we're going to go ahead and go to Input and go over to Virtual Machine. Here at the top, you will see host key combination, and we have a shortcut of none. Yours may be right control right now or something different. No worries. So in this case, what this does is this allows us to transfer our mouse pointer from the virtual machine to the host and vice versa. So every single time that you click the virtual machine, you're going to start using the virtual machine mouse pointer instead of your host. But let's say you want to transfer back to your host environment, you can go ahead and use the keyboard shortcut. So in this case, what we can do is go over here and then we can click Shift, which will allow us to change the keyboard shortcut to anything. So in this case, I use Shift. We could also use Control if we want to, or Alt if we want to. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and use Alt as my keyboard shortcut, which will allow us to transfer that mouse pointer. We're going to go ahead and click OK. Okay, so now let's go ahead and move into our individual virtual machine settings. And inside each virtual machine that we create or provision, we have a specific amount of settings that we can change and configure around. So in this case, right now, we just have our first virtual machine that we have created, and it's called Windows 10 Environment. And here we can change some of the settings. I'm going to highlight a few important settings that you will need to know when working with VirtualBox. So let's first go over the General tab here. And in Advanced, I just want to highlight that if you want to share your clipboard or drag and drop between either two virtual machines or your host environment and the virtual machine environment, you can go ahead and click the bidirectional or guest to host or host to guest, whatever you want. If we go to System here, and then we come to Base Memory, we can change our base memory to whatever we want to. In this case, right now, we only have this virtual machine set to 1 GB of RAM, but if we have more RAM or less RAM, we can always change. Now, if we go and hover down to Network, we're going to see a couple of adapter settings, and here we have Adapter 1, and the default is just attached to NAT, what's called NAT. And here we have many settings within this setting here. So there's different ways that we can go ahead and create our virtual machine network. And let's quickly go over the most important network settings when working with different types of virtual machines, depending on what you want. VirtualBox provides several different types of network settings. Each of these settings determines how the VM or virtual machine will interact with the network as a whole, as well as the host system providing the virtual machines. Let's quickly go over the different types of network settings. It's important to know which one you want to choose depending on how you want your virtual machine to interact. So the first one is not attached. Not attached explicitly defines that there is no internet connection that will be established. So it reports to the guest a network card is present, but it's as if the Ethernet cable is not physically plugged into the machine. The next is NAT. This is the default mode, which allows you to browse the web with full internet connection. This is primarily used for regular user workstations, so you can browse the websites, check emails. This is just with full internet connection. This is the default one. Next is NAT network. This works similarly to a home router with NAT configured. This groups systems together in the network and prevents systems from outside the network from directly accessing systems inside it. But the systems inside the network can communicate with each other inside the network and the systems outside the network. Next is bridge networking. This acts as if the virtual machines are real machines inside the physical network, so it acts as that's a real host machine. Often this is used for server environments such as mail, file, or web servers. And finally, there is host-only networking. This is when VMs can talk with each other and the host device, but can't interact with devices on the physical network. So there's no internet connection. And lastly, if we want to transfer files between our virtual machine and our host environment, we can go ahead and hover down to shared folders and go ahead and create a new shared folder path, which will allow us to go ahead and set the path to whatever we want to set it to. In this case, I'm not going to do anything here, but you can create new shared folders between your host and virtual machines if you want to transfer big files. So let's go ahead and exit out of the virtual machine settings. And finally, to go ahead, we can go ahead and start and stop our virtual machines just using the start and stop, and creating new virtual machines using the new and walking through the default wizard. All right, so we have created our little practice environment, which we will be using in the future, and even beyond the scope of this course, you're going to be using this as a way to practice your knowledge and apply your knowledge. So it's important to have a basic understanding of VirtualBox and more specifically, just virtualization in general.